Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Talking Real Estate with Champions Real Estate Team here, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Ambassador Real Estate Company. My name is Mark Wehner II, team leader here at Champions Real Estate Team. So every Wednesday we jump on, give a rundown what's gone on in the real estate market over the last 7 days, and we always like to start out with a quick tip. So quick tip today, those are as for home buyers. So as of July 1st of this year, so we had a new law that went into place, LB 187, basically as far as buyer agencies. So as a buyer's agent, basically when we are working with a buyer, we enter into buyer representation agreement. So basically what that means is you're working specifically with that agent. So if you come into an open house and let's say I have a listing and I'm holding that open house open and you see a house down the street that's not my listing and you want to see that house, then essentially we would have to enter into a buyer representation agreement to show that one house. Or I always sit down with my prospective buyers and clients and kind of go over and show the value of working with an agent. Then we can get into an exclusive buyer agency agreement where we are working exclusively with a buyer's agent. So basically, in that, it's the transparency of essentially how we get paid from commissions, the length of that agreement, basically being maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's a year, and what you feel comfortable. So that's something that when you maybe meet a new agent, if you go out to open houses and if they say, hey, I can't show you any houses unless you sign this agreement, that is actually true. For us to show you any house, we have to, have that buyer agency representation agreement signed. Also, the agency disclosure. So there's two forms that you'd have to have, working with an agent. It's just like when we go to sell a house, we are working exclusively with that seller to sell that property in that house, and it's the same thing. So you're working with that one agent from a seller's perspective. Same thing on the buyer side. We're going to be, listing the buyer from a buyer agency standpoint. So I think that's a great idea. It shows who you're working with. You get to choose, you get to select. So they don't, they can't say you have to sign this. You don't have to sign it. You just wouldn't work with that specific agent. So, sometimes maybe you're doing a trial and say, hey, let's see if it works out with the two of us working together. Then maybe we go look at a couple houses. And then we can kind of reassess. So I always like to do coaching sessions with my buyers, and kind of getting a good idea of where you're at, where you're going, where you want to be, and then show the value that I bring from an agent perspective. So, don't be caught off guard if you're new to the market, as far as from a buyer's perspective that, and you hear agents talking about that buyer agency representation. So that went into state law, license law in Nebraska as of July 1st of this year. So it's something that agents have been doing for the last at least year, almost a year and a half from the National Association settlement that we've talked about on the video before. But I think it's just a good thing so that buyers know exactly how their agents are getting paid, because there's some buyers agents out there that would say, "Oh, you don't pay me as an agent. The seller pays a commission." Well, that's not true. So make sure you're working with an agent that can explain it to you, and kind of how that works. So happy to do so. Like I said, I teach real estate continuing education classes. I just taught a 3-hour class on it to agents on how to explain it and go over it with the prospective clients and your buyers so that everyone knows what's going on from an agency perspective. So the best way to describe it is, what color jersey are you wearing? Are you wearing, as far as agency? So you want to be working on the same team as that buyer's agent, and not discussing with the seller's agent. Because if you come into an open house, that agent, typically, if they are the listing agent and they are working for the seller, they have a fiduciary responsibility to do what's in the best interest of that seller. So now if you're a buyer that walks into that open house and that agent doesn't let you know that, hey, anything you tell me as the buyer that walks into that house, I can tell, or I have to tell that seller, oh, they absolutely love it. They're approved up to, X, and depending on, so they may know what your motives are. So you got to be, you got to know whose team everybody's on in that real estate transaction, in that process. So that's something that I can explain to you, go over with you, have a coaching session, just an informative session of kind of how that works, and get a game plan for you. So, but let's take a look at what's going on in the real estate market over the last 7 days. As we check in here, so market's still pretty steady, fairly active. So we had 640 new listings. I think last week we had about 750 new listings. Weather has been a little rainy and stuff like that, so maybe that's playing into the parts. So we're coming into, Halloween, and things. That's where we're starting to see holidays. So you might see new listings tick down a little bit just with holiday season, which is normal. We had more new contracts written than last week. So yeah, so it just kind of ebbs and flows as it goes through. We had 332 happy new homeowners over the next What about is over the last 7 days. So yeah, so the market's still picking up, still doing well in this time of year. So just make sure you're staying active in those houses that are coming on the market. Making sure that you're making sure the condition is good. Any updates have you done, things like that. So that's a good thing that we come through and walk through with you. Got a couple of new listing appointments coming up here. Just going over and getting those houses ready, whether they want to get them ready now or maybe they want to wait till spring, and see what their timeline is. And that's all stuff that we go over with you. So if I have anybody who comes with me and says, "Hey, we're thinking about selling our house or we want to buy a house in the spring, when should we meet with you?" My recommendation is meet with us sooner than later. So that way you can get a game plan. Does it make sense to buy now? Does it make sense to wait? Does it make sense to sell? Those type of things. And those are all conversations that we can give you the pros and cons of each, and just figure out what's the best scenario for you specifically, because everybody's situation is different. That's the one thing I love about this business and working with people, is every transaction is different. Yes, the documents may be the same and the processes that we have, but the variable that comes into play is just people. Everybody's different. Everyone's got different goals and motives and timelines. And so that's what we do here is we make sure that you are taken care of throughout the entire process, because your situation is unique in that regard. So let's take a look at the 30,000 foot view. Not too much has changed on this. I think we only went up by like one number here and one number there. So one house. So we had 313 or 400, sorry, active listings in the Omaha Lincoln MLS. So we had 4,314 to this week. We had 4,313 last week. So one house different from last week. And so we got 2,434 Douglas Sarpy County listings, new existing listings at 1491. That went down a little bit from last week, and then our new construction at 1443. So 3.6 months supply of inventory. Our average sold price right around that 360 ballpark. So each, this is, like I said, this is the 30,000 foot view. If you're specifically going to get ready to sell your house, we would look exactly at your neighborhood, what's going on in your neighborhood, what's the inventory, how many houses have gone pending, what's the average sold price, what updates have been done in that specific, in that subdivision, so that we can position your house, especially now as a seller. Your buyer pool is going to be a little bit narrow because, a lot of buyers are like, well, I don't want to buy a house in the holiday season. I'm going to wait till spring, and all that stuff. So as a seller, you got to maximize your efforts, to get that house ready on the market, price it appropriately because you got a smaller buyer pool. And if you put in the buyer pool and those buyers kind of say, no, no, thank you, or we don't like the condition or the price is too high, those buyers are going to move on to the next one until you put it back in the buyer pool, whether you do some updates, or you reduce that price to get it back in that buyer pool to attract more buyers, to that house. And so what does that cost? Potentially time and or, equity or money on that sale. So that's why it's important to make sure that house is ready to go the first time, especially coming into the fall months, because your buyer pool is a little bit smaller. And from a buyer's perspective, there's not a lot of buyers in the buyer pool. So you have a chance to get out there and potentially get a good price on a house. It's a fair price. You may not be, getting multiple offers or paying, an exorbitant amount, but it's a good opportunity from a buyer's perspective and a seller's perspective to maximize both of your efforts in that regard. So, and then as far as interest rates go, so interest rates are kind of right around that 6%, give or take. We've seen, it's kind of leveling out in that regards. So it all just depends on the flavor of the week or what's going on, what numbers come out, and stuff like that. So government shutdown hasn't necessarily dramatically affected the mortgage rates from that standpoint of it. But if you have a government loan, as far as FHA, VA loans, those may have a little bit of lag time in them, but nothing too serious that we're seeing on there. But it's just being mindful of those. Maybe even heard kind of things about flood insurance. So some of those, the offices of the right the flood insurance, maybe delays in those. So those type of things that we are aware of. So we kind of navigate those waters, no pun intended, I guess, from the flood insurance. But yeah, like I said, if you have any questions, anything you want us to cover in any of these videos, let us know. And we're happy to help you. Like if you're doing a coaching session from a buyer's perspective, you're thinking about buying a house later, we'd love to sit down and chat with you, jump on a Zoom meeting, meet you for lunch, meet you at the office, anything like that, whatever's best for you guys. So appreciate it. Numbers down here, 672-7670. Reach out to me, and we will rock and roll from there. So take care. Have a great weekend, and enjoy the nice fall weather.